I don't even have my notes. I'm going to have to make this all up. I have no idea who this is. Richard is a neuroscientist who has worked at UC San Diego and specializes mainly in interaction between mind and matter and visual perception. And I have completely mislaid the bio that you gave me, so I'm blowing this once again. But I know Richard through his work at the Exploratorium, where after he was at UC San Diego, he came and has been developing exhibits and I think doing a lot of really forefront research as well through his work there, and certainly taught me everything I know about the brain and neuroscience. I guess you don't need this. You're wired. Yeah. Would you please say anything I didn't say that was important, because I...
If it comes up. It's only important if it comes up. Well, thanks. I want to thank Alan and the Department of Religious Studies for hosting this conference, and Casey for having the germ of the idea that led to this conference and suggesting that I come and participate. At first, when it was suggested that I talk about the neuroscience of nothing, I thought this will be interesting. It's always nice. It's not something I've ever studied or thought I was studying. It's always nice to have something like that provide a constraint to reorganize your thinking in a new way and see what comes out of that. But of course, the more I got into it, as we're all seeing, the more I find that everything is about nothing, and it doesn't actually constrain things all that much. So I wound up picking a few areas I'm going to get into that seem to be more closely related than others to nothing, and also areas that I tend to feel I know more about, but there's a whole range of studies in neuroscience, some of the things Alan alluded to in his talk that I'm not going to cover. So I'm, as Casey mentioned, at the Exploratorium now. The full title got cut off. We're not just a museum of science. We call ourselves a museum of science, art, and human perception. And we really take the approach that all of those are activities of exploration and ways of getting to know more about the world around us. And they all have in common this idea of activity, that it's not just taking in information, it's actively going out and learning about things and trying things. I tried to think of an exhibit we had about nothing, and this seemed the best I could come up with for this conference. This is a piece by Dave Barker. And there's one of our visitors exploring nothing. I don't know how many of you see that there are the columns there, and in between the columns you might see the shapes, but first you have to convince yourself to not look at the columns, but to look at the space between the columns. The visitor is also, well, this exhibit is called angel columns, because these shapes between the columns are supposed to represent angels, and so that's my religious reference for the talk. Tween angels. Okay. Most of what I think about in neuroscience, I guess, would be about there's something out there and how does our brain perceive that something. But there's really in sort of three other aspects that are kind of not part of that are the things I'm going to try to talk to. One is that there's nothing out there and we perceive nothing. And the closest I can come up with that I'm going to talk about is blackness. Another is that there's something out there and we can't perceive it, and that's invisibility, which is also something that's studied a lot in neuroscience and perception. And the final one, of course, is that there's nothing out there and we're still experiencing or perceiving something. So this, well, it's an introduction to blackness, and it actually turns out this doesn't work because we're not using a slide projector in the usual sense. This is a backlit screen, and so this becomes sort of trivial. So I'll ask you to imagine that you're sitting in an ordinary theater where there's a white screen. Think of sitting in a movie theater before the movie starts. You look up and the screen doesn't look black, it looks white because the room isn't completely dim. As soon as the movie starts, you can see on that white screen very black objects, if that's what's going to be up there. If this had been a slide projected on one of these screens, it would have turned that white screen into a white screen with black letters. So that points out that white plus light can make black, which is paradoxical in that all you've done to turn white into black is add light. You just added light somewhere else. So black, like many perceptual qualities, is really a relational quality. It's not an absolute. We experience it as an absolute. It seems to us that the color is the property of that thing out there. but actually it's based on comparing that thing with other things and making some sort of evolutionarily educated guess about what most likely is out there. If we actually were able to see the color of the things out there perfectly well during a movie, we'd be just looking at a white screen the whole time. I should mention also that a lot of these things we call illusions, and they tell us a lot about how the nervous system works. But they often don't correspond to what we see except when somebody's showing us the illusion. And that's because we have evolved to be pretty good at consistently representing what's out there in the circumstances for which we evolved to perceive. And you have to tweak it a little bit, violate the assumptions that are built into that in order to see that what we're actually doing is not something as straightforward as just detecting the thing out there, but in some sense generating a representation of the thing out there that happens to make a lot of sense under normal circumstances. Here is a related thing that was also alluded to, that at night we see the stars perfectly well. And I think I went too far here. During the day we don't see the stars. This has the same stars as the previous slide, but now the background is much brighter. And this relates to a number of things, but one is adaptation, that our sensitivity to what is nothing and what is not nothing varies all over the place. At night, stars are not nothing. During the day, stars become nothing because we're not sensitive enough to detect that difference. I don't know in this crowd and with this lighting if this is going to work, but one other demonstration of the relativity of blackness, and I like to do these things with black and white in part because, as different as black and white is such an ingrained notion, and the idea that black and white really are the same thing, you can slide them all over the place, I find pretty interesting. So I hope you all can see this. I'll try to go through it pretty quickly in case it's hard to see. I'm showing here a dark, almost black-looking piece of paper between two white pieces of paper. And when I slide this out to expose something even darker, the first one starts to lose its blackness, and the new one looks black. And as I bring that out, now this one looks black, and the one before it no longer looks black. And I can keep doing that up to the quality of blackness of paper I can get. And at each point, no matter how black something looks, you can put it next to something that's even blacker, and the previously black thing is no longer black. So I think that's as far as I can go. But in principle, I could keep doing that. And again, black is just a relative type of comparison. This makes sense, by the way, evolutionarily, if you think about the surfaces we're interested in perceiving, which are whites and blacks, versus the lighting conditions we see them under. The blackest black, like the center of that card I showed you, and the whitest white, like this, vary by less than 100 to 1 in terms of how much of the incident light they'll bounce back. But the incident light that's hitting them varies by about 100 million to 1. So by taking this relationship between that black and this white, we can not be thrown off by the enormous variation in the incident light that's hitting them. If we actually saw just the light coming from something as the color, then we'd have a very narrow range in which we could see colors, and everything darker than that, all we'd see is everything completely black, and everything brighter than that, everything would be completely white. Now, something related to blackness is shadows, and we were talking about this last night, and there's a very interesting demonstration of the importance of shadows that Dan Kirsten at Minnesota has done, and I'm hoping I can get this to work. I just tried this last night. Well, I apologize here. The dry run worked perfectly. Well, I should just move on to the next slide. time is typed. I'll briefly describe it. It turns out we ordinarily don't actually perceive shadows very clearly. We know they're there, but it's easy to miss them. A lot of times in art, people who haven't trained to look at shadows might not even draw the shadows. But the shadow has an important effect on the way we perceive things, even though we're not often aware that the shadow is there. And Dan Kirsten shows that in a demonstration of the way a ball moves, the ball can appear to change its motion very dramatically. Even though the ball itself does the exact same thing, he has only changed the way the shadow tracks the ball. So if the shadow stays attached to a ball, you see the ball moving on a floor. If the shadow separates from the ball, you see the ball jumping off the floor. Even if you don't actually notice the shadow, you notice the ball changing. There's a related odd experiment by a psychologist named Stuart Anstis, who once tried to adapt to a world in which black became white and white became black. And eventually he got to where he was able to move around and interact with most things pretty well. The one thing he never adjusted to was shadows. Because ordinarily if somebody walks by and the shadow is walking with them, again, we might not notice the shadow. When it's reversed and the shadow becomes bright, he couldn't get over seeing the shadows as things, so he'd always be jumping out of the way of these approaching shadows. So it really points out how much the shadows are there, and we just don't pay any attention to them. But in a number of cases, the shadow can be very important on the way we perceive things. Here's another demonstration. By angle, I can't see how well that's working here. It's by Sasha Logvinenko. And without a laser pointer, I'm not sure I can even quite show you, but there are some sort of horizontal diamonds in rows. And some of them look dark and some of them look light. And it turns out they're all exactly the same brightness. But because of the subtle shading along the cubes that they appear to be attached to as the bottom or top of, you see them almost as white and dark gray, even though they're identical. And again, you might not at first notice. Oh, thanks.
There's a button on the side.
So this is the dark diamond, light diamond, but they're actually exactly the same. And at first you might not notice the shading here that's actually causing them to look so different, but that shadowing is what makes you see these as looking so different. And here's another illustration of the importance of shadows. This is work done by Kleffner and Ramachandran on the way shadows affect our shape of things. You might see up here a region here where it looks like there are indentations and another region where it looks like there are bumps in the surface. And actually both of these are exactly the same, except the shadows have been reversed. And again, you might not at first notice that difference in the shadows, but you probably immediately notice the difference as to whether it's pushed in or bumping out. Another interesting twist, slight pun there, is that if you take this display and rotate it 90 degrees, this is exactly the same as what you just saw, but now the shadow edge runs vertically instead of horizontally. And again, there's a region, if you look one by one, you can see here, where the shadow is the opposite direction from the rest of them, but you no longer see that big difference in the shape. Those of you who are limber can turn your head 90 degrees on its side, and then you'll see that difference again. So we were talking a bit earlier, and Bob Miller raised the question, are shadows nothing? And I'm not sure, but they're certainly something that aren't paid a lot of attention to perceptually, but really have a very important effect on our perception. Well, here's another example of something that I'm not sure it's about nothing, but it seems as closely related as most of what I'm talking about. Gray, in some ways, is the nothingness of vision more than black is. That when there's absolutely nothing in the field, say in a pitch black condition at night or with your eyes closed, you don't see a deep, deep black. You see sort of a gray color. Gray is sort of the default state of vision. And you need some differentiation in the field to actually start seeing things lighter or darker than that gray. So with that twist of what I'm calling nothing, I want to point out these 6 rectangles, and again, I can't see with this color if it's working quite right, which all look pretty gray and are actually slightly different. If you look, you might see differences in the color of those. I'm going to keep them exactly the same and just change the background surrounding them. So now it's just the like I averaged the previous background. And now you can start to see these look quite different one from the other, at least more so than they did previously. So they're just as different from each other as they were before. This is yeah. So how much something has to deviate to be seen as something different is also a variable. In this case, it turns out that in a circumstance where there's a huge amount of variation, that leads us to see small variations as no variation. We really become quite insensitive to these differences. Whereas if there's very little variation, suddenly we become sensitive to these very subtle differences, and after a while they start to bloom out and seem pretty significant. This may be sort of a general principle. I think of it almost as, well, Casey last night showed an example with the umbrella, that after you're looking at some very vivid black and white stripes, it becomes hard to see the very weak black and white stripes that were the rain in the case of the person with the umbrella. More generally, it's almost like the Princess and the Pea story, that if you're used to almost everything being completely uniform, the tiniest variation suddenly takes on this big significance. I think of it in political terms. The same effect is why in the United States we think Republicans and Democrats are very different from each other. Here's another color effect that's called neon spreading. Some of you may see what looks like a continuous ring of bluish through here, besides the blue segments here. Turns out it's all white with just these blue segments. But we create this sense that there's sort of a transparent overlay here where you start to see the bluishness in between. So this is a case of where there's actually nothing there and we're creating something as if it's a hypothesis for what causes this pattern is that somebody took these black and white spokes and overlaid a bluish transparency. Well, one other aspect of vision that is maybe on this topic of our sensitivity to deviations from nothing has to do with our visual acuity. Most of us know but aren't often aware that we have very high visual acuity only at a tiny part of our field of vision. The central 1% of the eye really is one place, it's called the fovea, where we can see things at high resolution. And about half of our brain is devoted to processing information just from that tiny part of the eye. This is an acuity chart developed by actually Stuart Anstis, the same person who turned shadows into white in his experiment, that illustrates this. If you stare at the center dot, you'll have about an equally good time seeing the letters at any distance because they get bigger as they get further away from the center. So near the center, you can see very small letters, but while you're staring here, letters have to be quite big to see them in the periphery. And we're not usually aware of how poor our vision is in the rest of our visual field. We're also not usually aware of how much our eyes have to move when we're seeing in order to take the part of high resolution and point it in the places of interest. Now this leads to even a more profound case of what we're not aware of about our visual sensitivity, which is the blind spot. And this is going to be sort of a bridge to the second half of what I'm going to talk about. Most of you are familiar with the blind spot and have probably seen this type of thing before. But just to refresh your awareness of what it's like, I have a demo set up here. I'm not sure, since people are at such different distances, how well it will work for everyone in the room. But the basic idea is that if you, in this case, close or cover your right eye and look directly at the X, people at some distance will see this red spot disappear. Other people should move their eye along this line, right or left from the X, and there will be some place where you look where probably that red spot will disappear entirely. When it does, you don't see a black hole there. You see the green just fills in, and it's a uniform field of green there. So it turns out in our eye there's a pretty large area that's actually completely blind. It's different in the two eyes, which is why you have to close one eye to really bring this out. But where that place is that we can't see anything at all, we don't see a big hole in our vision. We don't even notice it unless somebody forces you to go through this type of maneuver to see it. And that's because we just effortlessly fill in from what's around it and patch that hole and make the hole invisible. It's so hard to notice that apparently this effect wasn't even described until I think the 18th century. Even though all through history people have had this blind spot and could have done this to find the blind spot. And once you learn about it, you can start playing with it. One trick that the story is told that shortly after it was described, I forget which king, let's say it was Louis XIV in France, used to amuse himself by looking around and imagining different people beheaded by putting the person's head in the blind spot and seeing that headless body there. It's pretty fun. You can actually do this in a mirror. If you get the right distance from a mirror and look off to the side, you can make your own head disappear. And you can wiggle your shoulders and see this headless body moving except for the head. That points out, besides being kind of fun, that the way the blind spot is filled in is pretty dumb, because we know we have a head and we know it's our body, and yet our brain can't put our head there. Our brain just fills in the wall behind it. Now, one other thing about the blind spot that's interesting is most of us have seen that before, and we know about it. We might even know where it is, but then we seem to almost forget about it. And as we start looking around, again, we don't know where that hole is. We have to do this to remind ourselves where the blind spot is. And we forget that there's always that blind area as we look around. And that seems to be sort of a general principle of sort of an unawareness of our unawareness that goes beyond the simple case of the blind spot in the retina into a lot of other types of syndromes and aspects of the brain that I think I'm about to be getting to. Well, this is just a reminder to think a little bit about some issues of invisibility. And after yesterday, we were talking about the vacuum that seems like nothing, but there's actually so much there. We're all in this sea of enormous amounts of information about the world. And we occupy a sensory niche, which is every organism has a certain subset of the information they can actually take in and process and make sense of. And most of that, they're completely senseless to. And examples are in electromagnetic radiation. Often we learn from what other organisms can do. Some that can sense electrical fields, magnetic fields, ultraviolet and infrared light, we can't see polarization. Sound, it's the same thing. We hear in a certain frequency range. Other organisms can hear lower or higher frequencies than we can. Smell, it's often pretty striking. We see lots of animals that have what seems almost a magical sense of smell because we can't detect it. And if you've ever seen a demonstration with some of the smells that people differ in the ability to detect, it's kind of spooky. Alpha-androstenone is one example. Some people can smell it, and it smells quite strongly. They might say it smells sort of like a locker room. Other people really can't detect it at all. So you open a vial of this and pass it around, and some people say there's absolutely nothing there. It seems like pure air. Other people wrinkle their nose and make a face and say this is putrid. There's an interesting history in studying animal behavior that humans have tended to think that if I can't perceive it, it's not there. And it's always been very mysterious how animals respond to certain cues. From bats and infrasound and elephants and ultrasound, bees seeing ultraviolet, snakes seeing infrared. It seems to be a repeating pattern that people scratch their heads and think that if that lower animal, as they thought of it, can detect this, I must be able to. So since I can't, there must be something else going on. Okay, well, to get to the brain a little bit. With all the talk about symmetry breaking and big bangs, I wanted to use that maybe as a context to point out how daunting the task of neuroscience is. This is the development of a brain from a fertilized egg to 10 to the 12th neurons, which takes not 15 billion years, but maybe, let's say, 15 months. And the task of trying to understand something this complex, where each of these neurons is an individual and communicating with large numbers of other neurons and trying to make sense of what's going on in there, we're so far from being able to have anything like a complete theory of neuroscience. We just have little bits and pieces of it to work with. And so I think there are a lot of things that we do claim ignorance of, and a number of the things Alan talked about today we're far from being able to address. And I'm going to stick with some of the big crude chunks that we have really something we can say about it that seem more addressable. And I guess there also is the question that's raised that I'm not going to answer that came from Tom's talk. We can ask about the brain, as he mentioned of God. Is the brain so complex that it will forever transcend human thinking? There's probably been millions of neuroscientist hours already devoted to trying to understand this, and it's in some ways embarrassing how far we haven't gotten yet. You can see in the brain some differences, some asymmetries, some wrinkles. Most of these don't actually have much to do with the functional divisions of the brain, but it turns out the brain can be broken down into lots of areas that seem to be, at least pretty crudely, specialized for quite different things. The visual part of the brain that I'm most interested in is back there, and people talk about there being about 30 different visual areas. And each visual area itself can be broken up into clumps and chunks that do slightly different things. And a lot of how we have found out about sort of these crude aspects of the brain really has come through accidents. Either injuries from war, or motorcyclists are a common source. Stroke patients who have damage to some specific part of the brain, we find out when that part of the brain is taken away, what part of perception or behavior is taken away. And some of this might be sort of obvious, that if you lose the whole visual area, you're blind, and you lose the whole auditory area, you might be deaf. Even that is not quite as simple as that. But there are other types of brain injuries that turn out to have symptoms that seem to be metaphysically profound. One example is injury to part of the parietal lobe that leads to a type of neglect in which people lose awareness of one side of the world. This can include that side of their body. It can include seeing that part of the world. And an illustration of this is when they're asked to copy a picture. You can see they faithfully can copy one half of the picture and basically can't even represent the other half. It turns out this isn't just something like being blind in one part of the visual field. It's as if not only the awareness of that side of the world is lost, but the ability to even conceive of that side of the world is lost at the same time. So just as with a blind spot, we don't notice we have a blind spot. These people don't know they're missing awareness of half the world. One approach that also is pretty familiar by now, and it's gotten pretty well known in popular culture, not necessarily with complete accuracy, but the basics are there, is a case in which it's not really an accident, but a type of lesion that's done deliberately, which is to sever the corpus callosum connecting two halves of the brain, at least of the cerebral cortex. And this was done in epilepsy patients for medical reasons. But it's one of the few types of experiments that's been done in neuroscience that really seems very profound in getting at philosophical and metaphysical issues, because what it leads to is answers, or seeming answers, to questions such as, if I cut my brain in half, is there one consciousness or two? And that really starts to get at issues of what's the relationship of consciousness to this matter in the head. You know, can consciousness be split when I split the matter? The basic logic of this approach is that each half of the brain only gets information about half of the world out there. In the case of vision, it's crossed, so everything in the left part of the visual field winds up in the right part of the brain, and vice versa. Then you can find ways to ask questions and get answers from parts of the body that are controlled by each half of the brain separately, and start to address whether one half knows what the other is doing, whether there's a separate consciousness there. And the answer seems to be, in the first place, that it's as if, when you look at it experimentally in the right conditions, there are now two consciousnesses. In a patient with a severed callosum, it's as if the right and the left half each have their own experiences and everything we might expect, even though we don't have a strict definition of consciousness, the types of things we look for in thinking about whether somebody is conscious or not seems to be duplicated, one for the right, one for the left half. What gets even more interesting is how, when this person is answering a question with one half, and then the other half sees that answer going on, what type of story is put together to explain why their body just did that? And there are a lot of cases in which it turns out that the answer is not completely baffled. It's, oh yeah, that's perfectly logical because, and some reason that actually has nothing to do with the actual reason. But what's basically what Mike Gazzaniga has called confabulation. In this case, the right hemisphere sees the command laugh. The person laughs, and now the experimenter asks the person who's going to respond to the left hemisphere, because that's the speaking half, why are you laughing? And gets some answer, oh, you guys are really something, you know, unaware that it had to do with this. And that's led some people to think about, in terms of free will, you know, yes, it always seems like we did something because here's a reason, but the fact that somebody in this case who you know did something for a completely different reason than they say is why they did it, has the experience that their free will led them to do it this way. Leads to thinking about maybe our free will is this sort of after-the-fact confabulator that puts together a story, oh, I must have done that because of this. That's highly speculative, but it's really interesting to see how that works in this type of experiment. All right, well, with trepidation, I'm going to see if this time I can get a demo to work. Oh, I apologize. Well, let me skip ahead just a little bit, and then I'll do this in a slightly different order. One of the things that comes out of studying the modules in the brain, and I've talked about some sort of crude modules, and in the case of the hemispheres, very general right versus left. And I should mention, by the way, that these types of differences between the right and the left hemisphere that you hear about that arose from studying patients with a severed corpus callosum really can't be expected to relate to all of us. The notion that we all have right brain personalities and left brain personalities, we have intact corpus callosums. So it's a whole different thing. You know, this is sort of a pathological case. And so you have to be careful not to extrapolate that to each of us as these two different consciousnesses. We've been doing a lot of metaphors here, and it occurs to me that it seems that all the scientists have been talking here from the left side of the room, and all the religious scholars have been talking from the right side of the room. So maybe there's a corpus callosum missing in this. In the visual system, the modules get much more specific. And hopefully I'll be able to get to the demo I wasn't able to just do that show how we have a part of the visual system that roughly sees just colors and a part that roughly sees just motion. And each of those also has different nothings. So in one area, if things are colorful but not moving, that's a nothing to the motion area. If things are moving but not colorful, that's a nothing to the color area. Again, they're in communication, but it's as if each of these modules has a somewhat independent view and somewhat independent experience. And some of what we know about that also comes from injuries, that you can have damage to your color area and see everything perfectly normal, but everything just looks shades of gray. Or damage to the motion area, and again, you see mostly normal, but you don't really see motion. You just see successive frozen frames of things. Now, I want to talk a bit about attention at the end, and this is sort of a segue. One of the very restricted ways people study attention has to do with these different visual modules. And it turns out, or at least one of the leading theories, is that while each of these modules in itself can do a fair degree of sophisticated seeing within its domain, whenever you have to combine information from those two modules, that's where it seems that something like attention is required. So here's a demonstration just in the realm of color and shape. If I show you this and I say, just find the horizontal blue rectangle, that's probably pretty fast, and most of you probably see it. If I give you the same command, find the horizontal blue rectangle. Okay. Here, sorry. Again, here's a horizontal blue rectangle, and now it differs just by color, and you can probably see that quite quickly. But if I go to this instance and say the same thing, again, there's only one horizontal blue rectangle. But now there's lots of blues and lots of horizontals, and suddenly it becomes much harder, and you have to look all over the place to find it. And so this is the type of thing that people think something like attention is what's involved, when you have to combine information from these two different modules that tend to be somewhat independent. Something has to sort of glue them together. And this would be the... Okay, so now I'm a little bit out of sequence because I didn't quite get this working as slickly as I'd hoped with the computer. But here's an illustration of something like what's happening with the visual modules I mentioned about, to give you a sense of these different nothings in the different domains. I hope the lighting is okay, that people can see that reasonably well. It's hard from here, especially on the color. This is kind of a representation. Really, it's symbolic. It's got a germ of truth, but it's not to be taken literally, of what the world might look like to different visual modules. So in a lot of the visual system, edges are what's important. In the upper left, you see a view of, this is actually from the floor of the Exploratorium, where only the edges are shown. There's another part of the brain that really focuses on motion. And if you see in this frame, everything that's stationary is invisible, but as soon as something moves, it becomes visible. So things come in and out of nothingness depending on whether they're moving. Here it's based on color. It turns out that blacks and whites and shades of gray might all be the same gray here. Colored things come out. It's also hard, you can't really see it here, but it turns out the part of the brain that see color really don't see much in the way of motion or depth. And that's why often these types of things where you take out a lot of the brightness information that motion and edges are based on and see just the color, things tend to look very flat and it's hard to see motion. I can do a comparison here. Maybe this one shows up a little more easily. So here's a view of a flower stall, showing the difference between the color view of the world and the motion view of the world. One sees just the colors. It's sort of difficult to see the shapes very well in the motion. The other sees nothing except when something moves. So that just raises the issues of what exactly is a visual nothing, and it turns out there are these multiplicities of nothing. One other demo I'll show, if you stare at the center of a rotating disk like this, and again, I'm not sure if this will work, but hopefully you've seen this type of thing before. Just stare at that for about 30 seconds, and you see continuous motion. During the process, your visual system adapts to that motion. And after about 30 seconds, this disk is going to stop spinning. And at that point, just look around the room or look at somebody and just fix there for a while and see what you see for the first 5 seconds after this stops moving. It does take a little less than a minute, but about that order to build something up. So the reason I show this is not just because this after effect is sort of interesting. It's a general property in perception that you adapt to one thing for quite a while, then you go to some previously neutral state and you see the opposite. Casey mentioned that with hold a hand in hot water and a hand in cold water, then you bring them both back to previously lukewarm water, and now one feels cold, one feels hot. In this case, I think it's interesting that if you pay attention to this effect and try it yourself and do it a few times, you find that when you see that after effect, you see things moving, but they're not changing their position. Well, that's sort of paradoxical from a physical sense of motion, in which motion is change of position. In this case, you see things moving for a while, but if you look or you point, you can see they're actually not changing their position. And that paradox is an indication of something like modules, in that the motion area doesn't necessarily try to reconcile with the position area. The position area may not be fooled by that motion after effect and say it's still staying in the same place. The motion area doesn't talk about place, it just says, regardless of where it is, I see that thing moving. And that paradox seems perfectly, something we can perfectly live with. Since I mentioned it, and there's a couple minutes left, I'll show you that shadow effect I talked about that Dan Kirsten did. That's this little window here on the left. I'm sorry it's not a little more dramatic here, but just watch the ball. And it's going to move back and forth twice. So the ball did exactly the same thing, and if I hadn't prompted you, you might not even have noticed that there was a shadow there that was different between the two. You might just say the ball rolled the first time and it took off the second time. Now the final thing I want to get to is on attention, and I started that on that a little bit. It turns out attention also is very important, not just for these sort of static arrays like I showed you, find the blue horizontal rectangle, but in a dynamic world where things are always changing and going on around us, and our attention has to always be going from one place to another. It also turns out people have different attentional styles and attentional skills. Most of us can attend to one thing pretty well at a time. It's hard to attend to two things at a time, and it gets very hard beyond that. One series of studies looked at, in something like a billiard table where there's lots of balls bouncing around, how many of those can you keep track of at the same time? And it's pretty hard past about one or two. But a group at Harvard looked at professional basketball players and found that they could keep track of considerably more of those at the same time than an ordinary person, which means a psychology undergraduate in most psychology studies. And it's interesting, we don't normally think about that type of perceptual skill as being one of the differences between athletes and ordinary people. Another study from Dan Simon, also at Harvard, set up sort of a little attention game here based on basketball. This is about a 30-second thing, and I'm going to ask you to do this. Some of you have seen this before, but I want you just to watch this privately, and at the end we'll ask questions, and don't say anything until it ends. The game is two basketball teams of 3 players each, one wearing white shirts, one wearing black shirts. But in this game, each team has its own ball, so there are going to be 2 balls bouncing around. What I want you to do is just pay attention to the ball the team in the white shirts has, and try to count how many times in the 30 seconds they bounce that ball on the floor. It's a very simple thing, and that's all I want you to do is be able to say at the end, how many times did that white team bounce their ball on the floor? So I'm going to start now. Okay, any numbers for the answer there? 10, 11? Okay. And now the question I have to ask is, how many people notice something else particularly unexpected while they're doing this? In particular, how many people haven't seen this before? How many hands? So all of you noticed something? Oh, I'm sorry. How many of you in watching that, notice something quite unexpected in the middle of this basketball game. Or it looks to be like 10 to 20% of the audience. I'm not going to replay the same video exactly as I did the first time, but instead of paying attention to the ball, just sort of look at the scene, watch the gestalt, and see if there's something you missed the first time around. Now I have to ask because sometimes people don't see that the second time either. But I assume almost everybody here saw the gorilla that time. And I also assume that had I asked you before showing this, if you were watching a little scenario in a tight space like that for 30 seconds, in the middle a guy in a gorilla suit walked across and banged his chest and walked off, could you miss it? You probably would have bet, no, absolutely not. But that's one of the powerful things about attention, is that in the same way that the fovea is the one place we have acute vision in the eye, blind spot we're completely blind to. There's something like a fovea with attention, that when we really focus our attention, we think we're aware of the whole scene, but we're actually zeroing in on this one thing, and it's remarkable how much people can miss, like this. I'm sorry? You know, people usually say 10 or 11. I don't think I've ever actually counted. But, and again, this is work from Dan Simon's lab, and he's done a number of studies over the year where each year seems to get more outrageous than the next as to what people can miss when they're paying attention to something else. Let me show you one more that's kind of fun that he also did. Now, this is not a question of what you're going to miss. In this case, the subject is not you, the audience. The subject is this student in a white or pink shirt, and you're just going to watch her experience. But basically, she's a mark, and this person in the construction hat has come up to start asking directions, and she starts giving directions, and then you can see what happens in the next 30 seconds. So most of you probably noticed that that's not the person who she was first giving directions to. In this case, we can watch this and think what an idiot she is, except that we've just been through the same thing with the gorilla. And it often is the first reaction people have when they go through this is, wow, I'm much stupider than I thought I was. It actually turns out we all have this sort of blindness, and just in the same way we're not normally aware of our blind spot, we're not normally aware of attentional blindness. But it's a very important phenomenon. I see I'm at the end of my time, but there are some other studies being done that are pretty dramatic by Ron Rensink, who works for Cambridge Nissan, and they're interested in what causes car accidents. And it's not that things literally were in your blind spot or that you couldn't see them. Very commonly, it's simply the case that your attention is somewhere else. Because we're so blind to our attentional blindness, most of us when we're driving don't realize that we become completely blind to what's in front of us when our attention moves to something else in the car, whether it's a radio or food or a cell phone. And this type of thing helps to bring out this point that we have this illusion that when we look around us, we seem to perceive everything all at once, even though we have very low resolution at best in the periphery, and our attention is just sort of bopping around one thing at a time. And you have to do this type of thing to bring out that really my attention is just one place at a time. It reminded me a little bit, and this might be a stretch, but I wrote down something David said in a completely different context. When we observe it to see if it's empty, we set it in motion. In the case of our perception of the world, as soon as we start to query ourselves, am I actually perceiving this thing over here? The process of asking ourselves that sends our attention there, and we think, yes, I've got that, I've got that, I've got this, I've got the whole scene covered. But in fact, it's just one thing at a time. And so I guess the point I want to conclude with the attention is that really there's a big push here, not just to learn about attention in terms of what we are aware of, but really the important thing is trying to force ourselves to become aware of our own unawareness, which is something that we seem to be built not to be able to be aware of. Thank you.